Welcome to the Movie Business Podcast, picking up where Movie Business Book left off. I'm Jason Squire, hosting a wide range of industry talent and executives to answer fundamental questions about the business today. Here we go. And today we're exploring the world of visual effects with Danielle Costa, Vice President Visual Effects at Marvel Studios. Early in her career, she was visual effects coordinator on Spider-Man 3 and Speed Racer, then visual effects executive, then Vice President Visual Effects. Credits include the Guardians of the Galaxy movies, the Black Panther movies, the Ant-Man movies, the Thor movies, 2 Doctor Strange movies, 2 Captain America movies, The Eternals, Black Widow, Shang-CHI and the Legend of the Ten Rings, and Captain Marvel. Welcome, Danielle.
Hi there. Thank you for having me.
Well, it's so nice of you to be on the podcast. Thank you. So, listen, that's a lot of work, okay? Because in the end credits, we all watch a long list of visual effects vendors and craftspeople worldwide. How do you keep it all organized?
It's quite a challenge. You know, on the big tentpole visual effects movies, you can have upwards of 2,000 artists working on a single show. Sometimes, to me, it reminds me of like being in the Army. You have generals at the top, and then they have first lieutenants. I actually don't know all the roles in the Army, but and then they have captains, and then they have sergeants, and then they have infantrymen. And that's essentially how it works in visual effects as well. At the head of the film, you have the director, and then under the director would be the visual effects team, which has heads of department leads, the visual effects supervisor and the visual effects producer. And then under them, typically there's a internal team that helps them manage all the facilities that ultimately end up getting hired. On some films, you can have up to 20 facilities involved, and each facility then has their own, hierarchical structure of a supervisor and producer. And then under them, they have generally CG supervisors and then sequence leads and then artists. And it adds up. And I guess the best way to keep it organized is probably very similar the way that an army does. The general at the top gives a command, and then it sort of comes down through the ranks, and everybody gives what they can to make it all come together.
Can you differentiate those producer and supervisor?
Sure. Generally speaking, the supervisor is the lead creative and technical person on the film who advises the director on techniques, methodology, the best way of achieving what they're trying to achieve. And also the supervisor is the one who has the best eye, who can say if because in visual effects, the goal is generally photorealism. There are exceptions, but generally speaking, the goal is for it to feel like it's integrated into the plate photography, or to feel like it's plate photography if it's all generated in the computer. So, plate photography doesn't look exactly like real life. There's lens distortion, there's grain, there's the cinematic language. So I think the role of the visual effects team, generally speaking, is to make the imagery look as it's in the language of cinema, like it's integrated into the plate photography. So that's the supervisor's role. The producer's role is to manage the vendors, to manage the team, to make sure that things are staying on track, which, by the way, both of them do together as a team. And frankly, in my experience, supervisors and producers, the lines blur. We have visual effects producers who have fantastic eyes, who are really good at, noting continuity, who have a lot of their own experience in terms of methodologies and good techniques, and they advise just as earnestly as the supervisor. And then I have supervisors who are really on top of things and make sure that things are coming on schedule the way they need to be. So, but I would say that traditionally, those are how those two roles are generally defined.
Wow. So let me ask as a follow-up, what are the other secrets of visual effects?
It's a good question. I think there's a notion that professionals always know what they're doing, especially at the outset. And I think, that's just false. I think a lot of the best ideas start out as pie in the sky notions, and ones that grow leg and have support definitely get there through a lot of trial and error, and sometimes it's not clear at the offset how to get to the end goal. I think the reality is that there needs to be a lot of room for experimentation, room to try out new ideas, crazy ideas. I'd say that most of the world's best and most successful supervisors learn from each other, and often that stems from friendships that span decades, started when they were just starting out in the industry and they were much younger. There is like a very vibrant community, and the community learn from each other generally, face to face. They build on each other's ideas. And also, like I said earlier, sometimes a leap from one idea can bear new fruit, but sometimes it may not. In fact, I'm working on a film right now that's in the process of look development, and not every experiment's working, and that's okay. It's all just a natural part of the process. I think visual effects is really one part mad scientist and one part street magician, because you may toil away at a novel approach or a new methodology, but in the end, it just might not work out, or it may not work out every time and in every case. And in that case, you'll resort to, smoke and mirrors like a street magician, or, simple tricks and nonsense to get it done in the end. And because all the audience really sees in the end is the final trick, and that's all that matters.
Well, those are great references. A related question, with all of this that's going on, how do you keep up with the tech advances in the field?
Well, I think a lot of people have different ways of doing it. I was really saddened when Cinefex closed their doors. They were this amazing publication that used to do these in-depth interviews with every single show and supervisor and talk about their techniques. I have, between me and my husband, who's also a visual effects supervisor, I think we have every Cinefex for 20 years, and
Wow.
I've read most of them. So that used to be a great portal for learning how all different shows approached all different kinds of things. Sometimes, though, I will admit that the published versions of things are more sanitized. And then so the other way of learning is to get to meet people and to get to learn who the people were who worked on the shows and get their take on how it went. And sometimes in those cases, you'll learn more about what didn't work than what did work. And funny enough, you can often get more out of what doesn't work than what does work half the time. Our head of visual development here once told me he learned generally more from a design that people weren't happy with than from designs that people loved, because it spawns better conversations and you learn more.
Good point. So let's back up for a moment and define visual effects versus special effects. Visual effects came later in the history of movies, but can we separate those two with some handy definitions? Yeah.
So visual effects is anything that's done in post-production, which typically now involves computer-generated imagery. Back in the day, it also included optical work, but that technique is almost never used anymore. Special effects is anything captured in camera, like pyrotechnics, or anything using like gimbals, or anything like that was created to give an impact, or water. General on set, that's generally done with special effects.
All the different weather effects in an interior situation, maybe gunshots and that kind of stuff. Well, thank you. So at this point now, let's widen to a question about a typical workflow. So there may not be typical workflow, but if you can guide us through defining elements, capture, approvals. I can give you an example. I don't know, just on the top of my head, let's assume that I have been transported to the quantum realm. So I'm an actor.
The quantum realm is actually quite a challenging environment. But yeah, we could talk about what you would need to do. An environment that's as crazy as the quantum realm. And depending on, where in the quantum realm you are, it actually, the process starts in pre-production when we go to concept artists and we ask them to draw pictures of what the quantum realm could look like. And that goes through an entire process of approvals. If it's in pre-production, generally the production designer is heavily involved in what that looks like. And of course, the director and the studio also weigh in. And then eventually we come to maybe a look and feel of what we think is interesting. In the case of the quantum realm specifically, there are areas in the quantum realm, depending on what scene it is, where the quantum realm itself is like a moving entity. It fritzes, it has undulating planes.
Right.
So something like that, you might get a really good idea of what it looks like from a piece of concept art, but then you have to explore, well, how does it move? At that point, there would be a handover to the visual effects department from the art department, and the visual effects team would probably find the vendor that made the most sense to do this work, and they would start doing look development on that. And if it's an undulating, ground plane or an undulating walls, they may try using software like Houdini, which is like a particle simulation software, to sort of emulate how the ground moves. And then you might put moving textures on top of that. And of course, then, you would try the experimental process, which is one of the things I was mentioning earlier. And I'd say for every one piece of artwork that kind of looks interesting, there may be 20 that are totally off the mark. But sometimes you're going to learn a lot from the ones that are totally off the mark. And this process of look development can take months. Some things magically come together really quickly, but that's rare. I'd say more often than not, difficult look design generally can take up to half a year of trial and error, different ideas. Sometimes we might kick it to multiple vendors and put multiple brains on it and give everybody the same brief and see what everybody comes up with and see if there are lessons, little things we can derive from each vendor that might be interesting or things to throw into this proverbial soup of ideas. Mm-hmm. And then ultimately, hopefully, you come to a place where everybody thinks, okay, this design is interesting, this design is working, okay, great. So then, yes, we would have to shoot you probably, depending on what you're doing, we might either shoot you on a green screen plate if it's the quantum realm, or maybe we'd have the art department build some floor that we could retain so that your feet interaction with the floor is easier to do. It's harder when it's all on green screen. And look at the forest as a whole. So that's, the visual effects departments that I have I'm lucky enough to work with are professionals and have done this for years, and they're very good at that. Sometimes and that's part of the learning process of working on big movies, that you're going to have thousands of shots, and as mentioned earlier, thousands of artists. And it's really important to maintain that 30,000-foot view. And so, generally speaking, you might have several key look development items, in the things that we were just chatting about, like the quantum realm, for example, would be one of them. But maybe the quantum realm isn't even just one environment. Maybe you go into multiple places in the quantum realm, and there's environment A, environment B, environment C. So each of those environments, you would have a strategy for. You would either target a vendor, you would target a look development schedule, and you would mark out on a calendar milestones that you would need to hit in order to be ready for shot production for that. Characters are often assets that require look development. We work with superheroes. Superheroes have powers. Superhero powers will require look development. There are things like vibranium. How does vibranium move? How does vibranium look like? That requires look development. Props. How do the props work? So there's, typically speaking, on a normal movie, there could be up to 100 look development items that you need to make sure get to a specific place where you're approving them conceptually before you start to see them in the shop. And it's the job of the supervisor and the producer to lay out a strategy and lay out milestones around those strategies, to find the right partners in the facilities to work with you in developing these items, and for everybody to stay on track. Not everything stays on track. Some things are really difficult to crack, and then to be mindful of that and to try to pivot and find other solutions, or maybe other facilities to help share the load if needed, and to stay nimble.
Wow.
And to not make a plan and then and be inflexible, because that will never work. You have to make a plan and then break the plan 500 times and continue pivoting as needed.
So flexibility is a key. Thank you for getting into such helpful detail. Let me ask now about your advice for someone wanting to enter the field.
Well, it depends, I suppose, what you'd be interested in doing. Like when I was coming up through the ranks, it was a while ago, and I've gone the production route. So I started at the bottom as a PA. Actually, I started as a set PA, managing walkie-talkies, getting coffees, getting lunches, that type of thing. And then eventually, moved into the visual effects department because I was really attracted to visual effects right away from the beginning, and then worked up into as a coordinator, production manager, et cetera, et cetera. If the goal is to become a visual effects supervisor, actually nowadays they have great university programs. Most art schools have university programs for visual effects, specifically to be an artist. That could be a path. Or starting work at a facility, maybe in a more assistant type role, and then taking the opportunities as they arise to learn the craft of visual effects and segue into an artist role. Because generally speaking, producers come out of production, which makes sense, and then supervisors come out of the artist track. So they're kind of two separate paths.
Well, that's a really important distinction to make. Thank you. Thanks for clarifying that. Well, this has been so much fun. You've been such a helpful guide through the secrets of visual effects. Thank you so much, Danielle Costa, for being a guest on the Movie Business Podcast. Gosh, thank you.
Of course. Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.